All right, so let's go ahead and actually introduce a trading partner for Robinson Crusoe. All right, so Friday is another person on this island, right? They are going to potentially trade with Robinson Crusoe. All right, we're going to assume that Friday also has 60 units of labor, just for simplicity's sake. And we are going to say that Friday can make one shelter for 2 labor and can catch 5 fish for 1 labor. All right, so here we have our number of resources, or the amount of inputs, the amount of resources, and then we also have our production capabilities here and how many units of labor it takes for each good to be produced. All right, so I'm going to just quickly draw a very small version of Friday's PPF. And we would create this just like we did Robinson. So when we go to our shelter, we'd say, well, how much shelter could Friday produce if they produced nothing but shelter, right? Well, it takes them 2 labor for each unit of shelter, and they have 60 units of labor. So 60 divided by 2 is going to give us 30 units of shelter. Right? Then we're going to go to the other endpoint, which is the fish. Right? If Friday only uses his labor to catch fish, how many fish can he catch? Right? 5 fish for each unit of labor. We have 60 units of labor, so that means Friday can catch 300 fish. All right, so that would be Friday's PPF. So I will. Make sure you have this information kind of ready. I will mention it when we need it again, but we are going to be using this again. But I wanted to just go ahead and throw up that information along with that PPF before we move on. And now we're going to talk about something that I started to write down before I wrote down the information about the PPFs, and that is the concept known as absolute advantage. All right, so the absolute advantage is the ability to produce the same good using fewer inputs than another producer. All right, so if you wrote this down while I was writing it down, I don't know if I was blocking it the whole time or not. I left out produce here, so it should be to produce the same good rather than to the same good. All right, so the ability to produce the same good using fewer inputs than another producer. So we can check this by looking at those production capabilities. I think probably the easier way, especially because most of the time we're either going to be given a PPF or we're going to have to create it ourselves, is we can kind of flip this around and think of it as, given the same number of resources, the ability to produce more of a good than some other producer, right? So it's really saying the exact same things, right? If you're able to produce something using fewer resources, then given the same number of resources, you should be able to produce more of that good than other producers. So when we look at the absolute advantage and we compare Friday and Crusoe, right? We're looking at absolute advantage. We're looking at who can produce the most given the same number of resources. Conveniently for us, we gave them the same number of resources. So if we look at shelter, who has the absolute advantage in producing shelter? All right, well, we look and we say Robinson Crusoe was able to produce 12 shelter if they produce nothing else, and Friday was able to produce 30. So Friday is able to produce more of the same good, right, given the same number of resources. So Friday has the absolute advantage in shelter. Right? Then we look at fish. Right? So once again, we'll look and we'll say, well, if Robinson Crusoe only spends their time catching fish, how many can they catch? They would be able to catch 180 fish. Compare that to Friday's total, which was 300, and we'll see that Friday also has the absolute advantage in fish. All right, so this is not always the case. All right, one producer can have the absolute advantage in one good, and another will have the absolute advantage in another good. All right, but this is a slightly more complex situation, so that's why we're going to use it as the example. All right, so we could have either case where, again, in our very simple two producer model, right, we have one person with the absolute advantage in one good and one person have the absolute advantage in another, or we could have a situation like this where one producer has the absolute advantage in both goods. Now, the absolute advantage, although it can be informative, is not the only thing that we should consider. Right? Because just because Friday has the absolute advantage in both goods does not mean that Friday would have no interest in trading with Robinson Crusoe. So we can kind of use this as an analogy for kind of a richer, more developed country that might have an absolute advantage in many products, and the potential for trade with a less developed country that does not have that absolute advantage, right? Even though this very wealthy industrialized country like the United States might have the absolute advantage, there are still advantages to trading with less developed countries that are not able to produce as much of a good given the same number of inputs. Right? So what we need to look at when considering who should produce what, if there is going to be trade, is what we call the comparative advantage. All right, so this is the real criteria, not the absolute advantage, but the comparative advantage is the criteria for whether or not we should be, who is going to produce what good. So the comparative advantage, or if someone has the comparative advantage for a good, it means that they have the ability to produce a good for the lowest opportunity cost. Now, we've already discussed opportunity costs a little bit, but let's go ahead and throw down a more official definition, because I can't remember if we actually did one in the last video or not. So the opportunity costs are, or the opportunity cost is the value of the best option foregone. And I'm not 100% if I spelled foregone right, but that's okay. All right, so those are the opportunity costs. So it's not the value of all the things that you are giving up to pursue one activity or to pursue the production of one good. It's just the value of the best option lost. Right? So in this, the implication being that whatever you're doing is the best option, because if it weren't, then you would be doing that other thing, all right? That higher value activity, that higher value thing. All right? So the value of the best option foregone. In this case that we've been working through, it's very simple, because we're just looking at production, and we're saying that there are only two goods. So the opportunity costs are, what do you give up? So given essentially for an hour of, or for a unit of labor, right? If you spend 1 unit of labor producing shelter, how many units of fish are you giving up? And vice versa, right? That's how we're going to be calculating these opportunity costs. So we need to know the opportunity costs for both Robinson Crusoe and for Friday in order to figure out who has the comparative advantage. Right? So when we're doing this, all right, when we're looking for, we're going to start with Robinson Crusoe. Right? So when we're looking for Crusoe's opportunity costs, the best way to do this, in my opinion, that I've seen, is we're going to set the endpoints equal to each other. So we're going to kind of think, right, those endpoints that we found, right, when we were looking at saying, well, what if Crusoe only spent these 60 units of labor to produce shelter? What if they only used those 60 units of labor to produce fish, right? We can set those equal to each other because they are both equivalent to using 60 units of labor, right? So for Robinson Crusoe's, in his instance, right, 60 units of labor is equivalent to 12 shelter. It's also equivalent, right, those 60 units of labor are also equivalent to 180 fish. So we can set up this equality that in terms of units of labor, 12 shelter is equal to 180 fish. So what we want to do in order to find these opportunity costs is to see, well, how many units of fish is Crusoe giving up in order to make 1 unit of shelter, right? And vice versa. So when we do this, we're saying, well, let's find the opportunity cost for shelter, right? What we would do is we're essentially just solving this like an algebra problem, right? And we want to get whatever we're finding the opportunity cost for by itself on one side, right? So in this case, we're trying to find the opportunity cost for shelter. So we want shelter by itself. So we're going to divide both sides by 12, right? So we're going to have 180 divided by 12, right? So the opportunity cost for shelter is 180 over 12 fish, which is going to simplify to something once I find it. There we go. So that's going to simplify to 15. All right, so in order to produce 1 unit of shelter, Robinson Crusoe is giving up the opportunity to catch 15 fish. That's his opportunity cost. All right, so we're not going to go through the whole thing, but finding the opportunity cost for fish is much the same, right? In this case, we're wanting to get fish by itself on one side, so we're going to divide both sides of the equation by 180. So we get 12 divided by 180 to give us an opportunity cost of 0.067 shelter. All right, so for each fish that Robinson Crusoe catches, the time spent catching that fish could have produced 0.067 units of shelter. So those are Robinson Crusoe's opportunity costs. All right, again, we're going to want to keep those in mind because we're going to be comparing them to Friday's opportunity costs. So once again, we're going to set up that inequality. 60 units of labor is equivalent to 30 units of shelter for Friday, and 60 units of labor is equivalent to 300 fish for Friday as well. So when we go to find the opportunity costs, right, when we're looking for our opportunity costs for shelter for Friday, we're going to divide both sides by 30, so we get shelter by itself on one side of the equation. So 300 divided by 30 is going to leave us with 10. So the opportunity cost, right? So Friday's opportunity cost for shelter is 10 fish. Again, every unit of shelter that Friday produces, right, the time it takes to produce that unit of shelter could have been spent catching 10 fish. All right, then of course we can also find the same information for Friday's opportunity cost for fish, right? A similar thing. We're going to try in this case get fish by itself on one side of the equation. So we're going to divide both sides of the equation by 300. So 30 divided by 300 is going to give us 0.1. So it's going to give us 0.1 shelter. All right, so that's Friday's opportunity costs for fish. And the time, again, just to rephrase that, and the time it takes Friday to catch one fish, they could have built 1/10 of a unit of shelter. So once we have these opportunity costs, we can finally figure out who has the comparative advantage in these goods. All right, so only one of them, right? So unlike the absolute advantage where one producer could have the absolute advantage in both goods, each producer is going to have the comparative advantage in one of those goods, right? That's just the way it has to work out. So we need to look to say, okay, well, what does it mean to have the comparative advantage? It means having the ability to produce a good for the lowest opportunity costs. So let's look at shelter. All right, so who has the comparative advantage for shelter? Right? Well, Crusoe's opportunity cost for shelter is 15 fish. Crusoe would have to give up 15 fish in order to produce 1 unit of shelter. Right? Friday would only have to give up 10 fish. Right? So in this case, Friday has the opportunity cost, or excuse me, Friday has the comparative advantage in fish, right? Excuse me, I keep flipping these around. Friday has the comparative advantage in shelter, right? So Friday can produce a unit of shelter, right, while giving up the fewest number of fish, right? So kind of, again, so comparative advantage, so compared to other places, right? Kind of comparing how much you're giving up, right? We're giving up less fish to create a unit of shelter when we're using Friday than when we're using Crusoe. So Friday has the comparative advantage in shelter. Then we can look at fish, right? Well, one, I've already told you that one's going to have it in one and the other's in the other, so we could just go ahead and say Crusoe is going to have the that Crusoe is going to have the comparative advantage in fish, and that's true. But we can also look at it and we can see, right, who has the lowest opportunity cost. Crusoe's opportunity cost for catching a fish is 0.067 units of shelter. For Friday, it's 0.1 units of shelter, right? So Crusoe is giving up less to create fish than Friday is, right? And so they have the comparative advantage. All right, so now that we've gone through all that, all right, let's actually talk about what this really means and why this is important. All right, so ultimately what we're trying to get at is we're trying to figure out who should produce what good, all right, or who should focus on which good, right? Whoever has the comparative advantage for the good is the one that should specialize in it or at least focus on it. All right, the reason for this is because they are going to be able to produce that more efficiently than someone else, right? If we look at Friday, the fact that Friday has the comparative advantage in shelter, it's saying that Friday can produce more shelter, right? Or produce a more shelter, right, while giving up fewer units of fish than Crusoe. So it makes sense for Friday to focus on what he is better at, right? Comparatively, right, he is better at producing shelter. So Friday should spend his time producing shelter, right, and allow Crusoe to do the thing that kind of is lower value or is at least not, let me rephrase that. So it makes sense for Friday to produce shelter because Friday is better at making shelter than he is at catching fish comparatively, right? That's kind of the idea here, right? His time is better used making shelter, right? So whoever has if you have the comparative advantage for a particular good, it means that your time is best used making that good, right? That's the most efficient use of your time, right? For Crusoe, the most efficient use of his time is catching fish, right? Because, right, Friday is going to be able to build more shelter while giving up fewer fish than Crusoe is, right? And Crusoe is going to be able to catch fish without giving up as much shelter, right? Without losing as much in terms of shelter as Friday is, right? So once we've found that comparative advantage, we can see that Friday should be producing shelter, Crusoe should be producing fish. Now, the last thing that we are going to talk about, I believe, or well, close to the last thing that we're going to talk about is, well, how does this make people better off, right? That was the whole thesis of this, and I've really just been rambling about absolute advantage, opportunity cost, comparative advantage, so on and so forth, without really talking about how this makes people better off. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to propose a trade, and we're going to look and see if Robinson Crusoe and Friday are better off at the end of this trade. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of take the extreme case. We're going to say because Friday has the comparative advantage in shelter, Friday is going to specialize in shelter. And by that I mean fully specialized. So Friday is going to spend all 60 units of labor producing shelter. All right, so Friday is going to produce 30 shelter, and we're going to say that Crusoe, since he has the comparative advantage in fish, is going to spend all of his labor producing fish. All right, so total production in this economy is going to be 30 fish, or 30 shelter and 180 fish. All right, so now we're going to propose a trade, and we're not gonna get bogged down in this. What I'm gonna say is that after trading, that Crusoe winds up with 10 shelter and 60 fish. So in other words, we can just do the simple math. Crusoe is going to trade 120 of his fish, so he's got 180 that he's caught. He's going to take 120 of those. He's going to give them to Friday in exchange for 10 units of shelter. So that means that Friday will end up with 20 units of shelter. So had 30, traded 10 to Crusoe for 120 fish. All right, so these are kind of arbitrary. I just picked these because I knew they would work. All right, there are other combinations that would do what I'm about to do with them, but I just picked these. So if you're wondering where I got these numbers, I just kind of picked them at random. You won't really be asked to do this. I will either go ahead and tell you this information for you to evaluate, or you just won't be asked with this kind of question. All right, so once we have their bundles, right? So we had our production bundles, how much each producer in this economy is producing. So the 30 shelter for Friday, the 180 fish for Crusoe. Now we have the consumption bundles. So how much each individual is consuming, right? Crusoe is consuming 10 shelter, 60 fish. Friday is consuming 20 shelter and 120 fish. So why is this important? Right, well, now we're going to do what we did just a little bit ago, right? We're going to look and see how this bundle compares to what each individual could do without trade. All right, so in other words, if Crusoe had to produce this on his own, right, would it be possible? And if so, would it be efficient? Made that way too big, that's all right. All right, got a little ambitious here at this first part, but hopefully we can still read this. So again, if we're trying to figure out if it's possible or not, and then if it is, whether it's efficient or not, we're going to be converting these units of goods into the resource at the person's disposal, in this case, units of labor. All right, so we want to be able to cancel out these unit things. So 10 shelter times 5 over 1 shelter. All right, 5 labor over 1 shelter. Again, those are just from Crusoe's production capabilities. All right, so canceling out shelter, we got 10 times 5 labor, leaving us with 50 labor, plus, all right, 60 fish times 1 labor over 3 fish, again coming from those production capabilities. The units of fish drops out, and we are left with 60 divided by 3, so 20 labor and we wind up with 70 labor. All right, so with trade, right, with trade, Crusoe is made better off, right? This is not a possible level of production for Crusoe. So if there is no trade, Crusoe would not be able to consume 10 units of shelter and 60 units of fish. That would have been impossible. But through trade, right, Crusoe is now able to consume above his own production capabilities, right, by taking advantage of those differences and opportunity cost. All right, so Crusoe is definitely made better off in this situation. Let's just check and see if Friday is as well. All right, so once again, Friday after trading has, what did I say? 20 shelter and 120 fish. So once again, we're just going to set up this equation real quick. Didn't do a whole lot better on this one though. I believe it was 5 fish for 1 labor. All right, so again, we're just going to set these up. All right, trying to cancel out our goods and be left with units of labor. So 20 units of shelter times the production capability, so 2 labor for 1 shelter. That's going to leave us with 40 labor. Plus, all right, 120 fish times 1 labor over 5 fish. That's going to give us 24 units of labor. Ultimately ending with 64 units of labor. All right, so even in Friday's case, we see that this consumption bundle, 20 units of shelter, 120 units of fish, right, that is above Friday's capabilities if Friday is having to produce everything on their own. So even though Friday had the absolute advantage in both shelter and in fish, right, Friday is still capable of being made better off through trade, right? And again, that's because you're taking advantage of these differences in opportunity costs. Friday is devoting more time at the thing that he is relatively or comparatively better at between those 2 goods, and Crusoe is devoting his time to the good that he is better at between those 2 goods, right? Comparatively between those 2 goods, all right? And so by taking advantage of those differences in opportunity costs, both Friday and Robinson Crusoe are made better off, or at least are consuming above their production capabilities, right? Which I would say, generally speaking, would almost definitely ensure that they are both better off. All right, so that is how kind of this idea of comparative advantage leads to people being made better off by trade, right? Taking advantage of these differences in production capability, which we didn't really actually touch on that much, but this could come from anything. This production capability, what we're really saying here is levels, so if we're looking at it kind of globally, levels of education of the populace, like, so how well educated is your population, right? What's the climate like, especially if you're talking about agricultural products. There are some countries where the climate's better for growing some fruits and vegetables, and there are countries where it is not, right? You probably wouldn't try to grow mangoes in Iceland or Greenland, but you would probably try that in some other country, like, I don't know where mangoes grow, Mexico, I think, maybe. Something somewhere more tropical, right? If you're trying to produce computer chips, right, we're gonna, in the US, we are going to have a comparative advantage on that because we have a fairly highly educated workforce, right, or have a large number of highly educated individuals in the US, all right, compared to a less developed country. Say, I mean, there are, wherever, we're not, I mean, there are a lot of less developed countries, so Uganda, Haiti probably, right, somewhere like that, we would have a comparative advantage in that regard. And then also, of course, just access to inputs as well is going to play a factor into that. But by taking advantage of those differences, right, we can produce more goods, right, at the most efficient level, right, taking advantage of those differences in opportunity costs, finding out who has the comparative advantage, who is giving up the least to produce something, right, so that we're not kind of taking a net loss, right, and even if a country has the absolute advantage in multiple things, right, or in two things in this two good economy, right, we can still, right, that country can still be made better off through trade. All right, one last thing, we're going to keep this short as possible. It really is going to take about 5 minutes, if that. All right, trade and globalization. I can't remember where it falls in the syllabus, but at some point I believe we're going to get to a chapter on international trade. I should probably check the syllabus to make sure I've got that in there. If not, if it's not in the syllabus, we won't do it, but if it is, we will. And we're going to be looking at these kind of ideas a little bit more carefully at that point. But just to go ahead and introduce this while we are talking about trade in general. So we've been looking at it kind of at a very micro level where we just have two people, but these concepts can be extended to more than two producers, and they don't have to be individuals. They can be firms, they can be countries we can look at as the producers. All right, and we're also not going to be limited to just two goods, right? There's going to be a multitude of goods in reality. So, we've been kind of looking at this on a very basic level and saying trade makes people better off, right? And a lot of these ideas and concepts are going to be very generalizable. We're going to be able to apply them to any situation. But one thing I do want to address is, does trade always make everyone better off, right? And the answer to that is complicated, but the short answer is no, not always. Right? There are going to be some instances in which trade makes some people better off. There are going to be some instances in which trade makes some people worse off. And we're going to talk about how that occurs. Right? So, kind of generally speaking, people are made better off. Actually, I will say this. Generally speaking, kind of globally, people are made better off by trade. Right? Even people that are quote unquote hurt by trade are still made a little bit better off, but the problem is how widespread those benefits are. Right? So again, I'm already trying to get too deep into this for the last thing on this chapter. Right? Let me circle back. So no, not everyone is always made better off. Right? If kind of through trade, through free trade, someone in one country, right, or a country in general loses the comparative advantage in a product, right, and so people start shifting the production of that product from one country to another that actually does have the comparative advantage in it, right, which does happen, right, then some people are going to be made worse off, right. For instance, the people that had that job producing that good in the place where the job is leaving from, right? So, for example, if jobs are going from, I don't know, Mexico to Panama, for instance, right? So let's say in some industry, right, Panama now has the comparative advantage in producing this good, right? Then those jobs are going to move from Mexico to Panama, and the Mexican workers that were doing those jobs are not going to have those jobs anymore, right? So in that case, they are made worse off, right? So that is going to be a criticism of kind of globalization, right, and an expanding trade and free trade. However, an important thing to note is that trade is still good, right? Trade is still beneficial, right? That one individual might be bearing the costs, right? Very concentrated cost of trade and globalization, the person that lost their job. But what often gets glossed over or not recognized is the benefit to everyone else, right? So this is a case of something that you're going to hear more from me on, but it's as we go through the semester, but it's a case of concentrated costs and dispersed benefits. The benefits of globalization and free trade are very large, but they're spread out by the millions, if not billions, of people that are involved in that market, right? So a move from producing this good in Mexico to producing this good in Panama might only reduce the cost, right, to consumers that are actually buying this good by pennies, right? But if you look at that reduction in cost spread out to, well, how many consumers are saving 1 penny, then that's really the benefit, right? How much were all of these millions of customers saving a penny at a time? How much better were they made off versus, right? But that's kind of hard to see, right, on an individual level, right? Versus the person in Mexico who no longer has a job, right? That's a very concentrated cost, right? Because losing your job affects that one person very deeply, right? As opposed to a 1 cent reduction in the price of a good for millions of consumers, right? So even though trade and globalization are going to be sometimes attacked because they don't make everyone better off, specifically those people that lose their job because of kind of this kind of process, right? They are most of the time ignoring the fact that millions of other people are made better off, right? And if you compared, right, the total benefit of globalization and trade to the total cost of it, all right, the benefit is almost always going to outweigh the cost. Right. However, that doesn't really help the person that lost their job, right? But still, it is, all right, on a global level, all right, still beneficial. All right. Like I said, depending on whether I put it in the syllabus or not, we're going to talk more about this. But I did want to introduce that and just kind of show that even though so that is one. Again, that is one criticism of globalization and free trade. But again, as a whole, the economy, the market, right, consumers in the market, total welfare, right, the total amount of well-being, right, is going to increase, right, although that's going to be spread out among more people. It's going to be less noticeable than those very concentrated costs, which overall are lower than the total benefit. All right, all that to just say, trade is good, although there are instances where on an individual level, right, it could appear that it's not. All right, but that's all for this video. I will see you in the next one.